as we come across the various individuals who are woven into the biblical narrative, it can be really tempting to try and sort the characters like really crudely into goodies and baddies, because that's a nice simple way for our brains to sort things. And that's how it is in Marvel and in Star Wars and in Disney. You have goodies and baddies, and if we are tempted to come to the Bible with that lens, then we'll see people will be like, well, Moses, goodie; Pharaoh, baddie; Daniel, goodie; Nebuchadnezzar, baddie; John the Baptist, goodie; Herod, baddie. But the reality is, these aren't just some fictional characters in a made-up story. I think we would all acknowledge that real people are way more complex than this. No one is a total goodie and no one is a total baddie. Goodies get into road rage sometimes, and baddies can still love their mums and their kids. And I think there's maybe no better example of this kind of complexity than Saul, the first king of Israel. It would be really easy to place David, his successor, straight in the goodie column and to place Saul in the baddie column. But if you take the time to read through the account of Saul's life, and if you're intentional about trying to read it through an empathic lens, I think that what you find is a deeply complex person with a number of struggles. I think you find a man whose life presented some amazing opportunities, but unfortunately a man whose life also exposed his weaknesses and insecurities, which ultimately got the better of him. Now, as we stand here on the 1st of January and we look at the new year ahead of us like a perfectly white piece of paper just waiting to be written on, some of us have maybe started thinking about resolutions. If you have started thinking of any resolutions, you can put them in the chat if you want to share with us some of the things that you're resolving to try and do in 2022. And maybe some of us are thinking about resolutions. That's all well and good, but I want to propose to you aiming for something a bit more substantial than a resolution to eat more vegetables or eat less chocolate or to exercise more, all of which are very noble endeavours. But I want to propose that we start the new year with forgiveness on our minds. I think we all know how important forgiveness is, and I think if we're being honest, we also all know just how difficult it is to discharge our responsibility to forgive. And I say responsibility because that's literally what it is. It's a mandate from Jesus himself. Forgive those who trespass against you. So that means that you don't get to opt out of this one. Forgiving others is mandatory. On reflection, I realised that I used to view forgiveness as like a top tier virtue, but not quite on the same level or plane as love, which is like the ultimate virtue. But on reflection, I've come to think that forgiveness actually is love. Like the distilled essence of love, that they're one and the same. The same way that if you were to distill lavender or eucalyptus or peppermint, and you'd end up with the essential oil, because the oil is like the concentrated essence of the plant. If you distill love, the residue that you get is forgiveness, because forgiveness is the very essence of love. Because I mean, anyone can like someone that's nice to them all the time. But to love someone, that means to embrace the things that you don't like, to embrace the things that can and do hurt you. Embracing someone in spite of the things that hurt you, in spite of the things that cost. And that's literally what forgiveness means. Absorbing the cost. So you can't say, I love you, without also saying, I forgive you. You can't say, I love you, without also saying, I will forgive you. We can learn a vital lesson about doing forgiveness from Saul. So King Saul had been sitting at the summit of all Israel, appointed and anointed by God. But the Philistines, they had no interest in paying homage to Saul or God. And so they had pitched up on Israel's territory, and they initiated this proxy battle with their giant champion Goliath representing their interests. This is a battle that we spent quite a lot of time at the end of last year reflecting about and talking about. And so Saul stood head and shoulders above all the men in Israel, but Goliath stood head, shoulders, chest and abs above Saul. And so Saul didn't want to fight Goliath, and he didn't have a single soldier in his army that did. But he did have a shepherd boy. David, the shepherd, fearless and courageous, fronts up to Goliath and kills him. And this triggers a response from the Israelite army, who then proceed to chase the Philistines out of their territory. And the text says this in 1 Samuel chapter 18. As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out of all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said, "They've ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they've ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom?" So Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house, while David was playing the lyre as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul originally had a great affection for David, which actually only grew with David's acts of valor. But now people are singing songs about David. Saul has killed his thousands, David is 10,000s. And Saul is sitting here thinking, like, are they having a laugh? Are they trying to say that David is 10 times the man that I am? Are they having a laugh? Who do they think had the wisdom and the courage and the tactical nous to send David in the first place? But do I get any credit for that? No, this is a joke. Saul feels like David has done him a wrong. He feels like his reputation is being besmirched, like his government is being undermined. And he clearly struggles to deal with these feelings, and they get the better of him, so much so that Saul tries to execute David, not once, but twice. But David escapes. And so now, unfortunately, their relationship degrades so badly that David has to flee from his home and live life on the road, because Saul just can't get a handle on his feelings. And it's not enough that David has fled, Saul still sees David as a threat, and so he goes out of his way to find David, and he takes a unit of soldiers and he heads to where his intelligence services have told him that David is hiding out. But David sees Saul before Saul sees David, and so David addresses the king of Israel from afar. And it says afterwards, David also rose up and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and did obeisance. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of those who say David seeks to do you harm? This very day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in the cave, and some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not raise my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." When David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. Today you have explained how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For who has ever found an enemy and sent the enemy safely away? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day." So what we find here is that David actually gives a textbook demonstration on how to deal with relational issues. So number one, he addresses the issue instead of burying his head in the sand. He's humble in spite of the fact that he thinks he's the innocent party. He's transparent and he clarifies his side of the story, and then he takes the time to listen to the other side of the story. And then if we look at Saul's response, Saul weeps, he's contrite. He tries to make peace with the situation. He even pronounces a blessing on David. So may the Lord reward you with good. Now the word is never used, but the theme totally cuts through this particular narrative. This is forgiveness. Regardless of what David has or hasn't done, Saul has seemingly forgiven David for the infringement that he believes he has suffered. And it's a really tender picture of humility and forgiveness. Like they bury the hatchet. They're emotional, they cry, it's tender. They bury the hatchet, and every man now goes back to his home having enjoyed the fruits of reconciliation. Oh, but then wait, what's this? Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah saying, "David is in hiding on the hill of Hachilah, which is opposite Jeshimon." So Saul rose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. So David and Saul had gone back to their respective homes to live their respective lives. Everything appeared to be roses, but then someone comes and has a word in Saul's ear. "We've seen David, he's camped out near Jeshimon." And so Saul then takes a unit of his special forces and he hits the road once again to go and find and kill David. And just to be absolutely clear, this is just one chapter after Saul forgave David and moved on. That was 1 Samuel chapter 24. This is chapter 26. And in that intervening chapter, David does nothing to aggravate Saul or reopen the wound. They have no interaction whatsoever. But here is Saul once again acting out on the same feelings as before. "But we thought everything was okay, Saul. We thought you'd forgive him. Now you're trying to kill him again? We thought you'd forgive him." The easy way to make sense of this scene would be to call Saul obsessed or even deranged. But he isn't some cliched baddie in a Disney movie. He's a complex human being. Maybe Saul genuinely meant it when he forgave David. Maybe he genuinely meant it when he wished him well and pronounced a blessing on him. He meant it when he sought to let go of his angst and his resentment and his bitterness. Maybe he meant all of those things and he left it all behind and he went home to his bed feeling better and lighter. We have no reason whatsoever, based on what the text says, to believe that Saul was being two-faced or duplicitous when he forgave and made his peace with David. What if that day he did forgive him, but then he woke up the next day, the next week, the next fortnight, and the feelings all came back again? as feelings can sometimes be prone to do. Maybe the anger, the bitterness, the resentment, it all came back. Maybe Saul is experiencing the same changing tide of feelings that we all feel when we are hurt, and we forgive someone on Monday, but then on Friday the feelings of anger and pain just resurface. Maybe some of you here have transcended already and have mastered the art of forgiveness, but I'm pretty certain that there's at least one person here who is just like me. And there's times when you've forgiven someone and you think everything is hunky-dory, but then a bit further down the road, the feelings resurface. The feeling of being violated, the feeling of being wronged, and you don't know why. Having forgiven David, Saul found himself tumbling down the same hole again. He goes to find David and to kill him again. He must find himself experiencing deja vu. It says, Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" David said, "It is my voice, my lord, my king." And he added, "Why does my lord pursue his servant? For what have I done? What guilt is on my hands?" And in verse 21 it says, "Then Saul said, I have done wrong. Come back, my son David, for I will never harm you again, because my life was precious in your sight today. I have been a fool and have made a great mistake." So once again, David is humble. He states his case. He leaves room to listen to the other party, just like before. And again, Saul is apologetic. He owns what he has done. He's reconciliatory. And again, even though the word is never used, this scene is cut through with forgiveness. But it's a repeating loop. Just the same thing happening again. Saul even pronounces a blessing on David again. Then Saul said to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them." So David went his way and Saul returned to his place. And look what David then says to himself in response. David said in his heart, "I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." Saul has literally just forgiven him, and this is how pessimistic David is feeling. David's like, "I've heard it all before. This is a loop that we're stuck in. You're angry, then you forgive me. Then you take back the forgiveness and get angry. Then you forgive me." It's exhausting. David can see, playing out before his eyes, the cycle that they're stuck in. Saul trying to forgive, but just unable to get over the finishing line. And David, in his wisdom, can see, if Saul doesn't get a handle on this, it's going to be the end of me. And I don't see him getting a handle on this. I think that perhaps Saul's ultimate issue here is that he doesn't fully understand how forgiveness works. And I think this is a problem that we can encounter as well. I think metaphorically speaking, it's like Saul sees forgiveness as like taking your driving test, where you realize that something needs to change. You need to drive. And so one day you do your test and now you're a driver. In that one act, you're officially a driver. So it's like in Saul's mind, David has confronted me and shown me that something needs to change. I've said sorry and I've let go. In that one act, now I've forgiven. But those of us who are drivers, I think we understand that you don't really become a driver by passing your test. That's only on paper. You become a true driver by driving day by day by day until in time you do your gear changes and you do your mirror checks and you do your maneuvers without even thinking about it. It's like you consciously have to think about changing gears every day until you reach the day when you don't even have to think about it. You consciously have to think about parallel parking every day until you reach the day when you don't even have to think about it. You consciously have to make a decision to forgive your husband, your wife, your friend every day for the thing that hurt you. Lord, help me to forgive them, until you reach the day when you don't even have to think about it anymore. It's not a one-time, one-off thing. It's an everyday process that you commit to until the process in itself is in the rearview mirror. You ask God every day to help you to forgive until the day that you don't need to ask anymore. I think that maybe Saul's biggest mistake was not understanding the commitment that forgiveness demands. If we take it at face value that Saul means what he says, and I think it's important that we do, then the first time that Saul forgave David, he went home with the best of intentions, but he didn't know that he wasn't finished yet. And because he didn't know, he couldn't commit to the process that forgiveness necessitates. And so in time, the spectre of resentment and bitterness, it came back. And he couldn't deal with it. I think many of us look at the tragic story of Saul and maybe we think to ourselves, what's wrong with this guy? And clearly there are a lot of things wrong with him. I think that a modern day psychotherapist would have a field day and would identify a lot of health issues to grapple with. But what we probably miss is that Saul's experience with forgiveness is generally paralleled with ours. Perhaps his is more extreme, but the fundamentals are the same. Being unprepared for the ongoing commitment that is required. And the tragedy is that Saul's life never really recovers from this point. He doesn't know how to get back to God. He falls into spiritualism. And finally, he suffers an untimely death on the battlefield. You and I may also have an inability to experience closure in forgiveness. And thankfully, it probably won't end in the kind of dramatic circumstances that it did for Saul, but it will have a bearing on our ability to find our way as close to God as He wants us to be. Because God is love. And that means that God is also forgiveness. And to experience the fullness of the God who is forgiveness, we must experience the fullness of forgiveness. Jesus talks about forgiveness a lot in the Gospels. And often it's unprompted, but there is a time when he's specifically asked about it. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. Now to anyone who's familiar with this exchange, we generally read this and infer that if the member sins against you 77 times, you have to forgive each infringement, which is a perfectly valid and plausible reading of the text. But do you know how you can also read this text? You can also read it as saying that if someone sins against me, I'm to forgive that infringement 77 times. That is not a one and done situation. Be prepared to forgive again and again and again. Be prepared to pray about this particular thing every morning when you pray. Be prepared to make a conscious decision every day. I forgive you today. I can't do anything about tomorrow. And how I felt yesterday is in the past. But today, I'm forgiven. And I'll bring it to God every day until I don't have to. Earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gives his followers instructions on how to pray. It's actually a step-by-step guide that has become known as the Lord's Prayer. And there's this one part in the Lord's Prayer that says this. In verse 11, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. Give us this day daily bread. It's clear from that line that this is supposed to be a daily prayer. This is a prayer about things that you grapple with every day. And then immediately after making clear that this is a daily prayer, Jesus says, forgive us as we have forgiven. He's making it clear that grappling with forgiveness is something that should take place every day. That's where progress and freedom exists. How different might Saul's story have been if he understood this principle? Well, I think that God is giving us the opportunity to understand this. And I can't think of a more healthy and healing and worthwhile resolution to make at the start of a new year than to commit to beginning a journey of forgiveness. Because we all have people that we need to forgive once and for all. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that we are being transformed into the image of Christ from one degree of glory to another. And he says that this transformation comes from the Lord, the Spirit. So the one who is forgiveness, who embodies and represents forgiveness, the one who is forgiveness is making us into his image by giving us the power to forgive. But we also help each other through support and encouragement and accountability, because we're all in the same boat, all requiring forgiveness and all having forgiveness required of us. Because forgiveness isn't something that we can do in our own strength, but in seeking God every day, he will set us free from the things that keep us locked in a cycle like Saul. And so to this end, today we're launching something called the Forgiveness Project. And so we want to go on a journey of forgiveness together throughout the month of January. And so starting today, each day, we're going to release a devotional reflection and a prayer specifically on forgiveness. It's a 2-minute thought to empower you to move forward in forgiveness every day. And you'll find them posted daily on Instagram and on our YouTube channel. And they're bite-sized, they're easy to digest, and easy to share. It's a great way to start your day with something devotional that's going to get your mind thinking about these important things. They're built for your phone and your device. It's a daily reminder throughout this month for us to bring our trespasses before God. It's a reminder that unfortunately forgiveness sometimes isn't a one and done situation, but we need to work at forgiving certain things every day until we don't. It's a repeated request to God to help us to avoid the pitfalls of Saul. I truly believe that at the end of this 31-day journey, throughout the month of January, we will be able to experience a level of healing and restoration simply brought about by your consistent commitment to forgiveness, by thinking about this and reflecting on it every day, by starting our day or pausing in the middle of our day to remind ourselves that we need to pray for God to help us to forgive this person, this group of people, this situation every day. And so finally, I want to close this segment by giving each one of us a quiet minute to speak to God. And I simply want to ask you to ask God to place on your heart the person or the people that He wants you to bring before Him every day so that you can forgive. And so that we can experience the healing that forgiveness brings. And so we can close some painful chapters in our lives. And so we can move forward in freedom. And so at this time, I'm going to give each of us a minute to just speak to God about forgiveness, about letting go, and to ask Him to show us who is the person, who are the people that we need to present before Him every day throughout this month, in the hope that by the end of this month, we will have made progress towards freedom. And after that minute, I will just say a prayer to put those things in God's hands. Father in heaven, we thank you for the gift of forgiveness that is freely available to us. We thank you that Jesus extends forgiveness to us at every moment of every day, and we are covered by His blood. But it's something that we find difficult to enact for others, dear Father. And so my prayer this day, the 1st of January, is that you will place on our hearts the people, the situations that we need to be able to forgive. You will give us the courage and a commitment to place these things before you every day, that we can move forward and begin letting go, that we can present them before you every day until we don't have to present them before you, because you've helped us to work through and process and let go. So everyone who's on this call, those who have thought of a person, those who you've placed a person on their hearts, a group, a situation, I want to present all of these before you at this time, dear Father, and ask you to give us the strength to commit to a process that can and will yield results if we're willing to trust you and to move forward. We place it in your hands, and my sincere prayer is that at the end of this month, we'll be able to experience freedom, dear Father. We'll even be able to come and testify that you've helped us to move forward and to be free and to experience healing because of the journey that you went on with us. Thank you, Father. In your name we pray. Amen.